Sometimes the cruelest words we speak come back to teach us the most about love. Sometimes a man's quiet strength speaks louder than all our pride and money combined. In the cattle town of Ironwood Bluff, Arabella Vexley owned more land than most men could dream of, but she couldn't own the heart of one stubborn cowboy. When she mocked Calder Boone at the barn dance, demanding he prove his worth by giving her 10 sons, everyone laughed, but Calder just walked away. The next morning, he came back with something that would change her life forever. What could a simple cowboy give a woman who thought she had everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1885 had painted Ironwood Bluff in shades of gold and promise. Dust clouds rose from the main street like prayers ascending to heaven, kicked up by the constant parade of cattle drives, supply wagons, and men chasing fortune in the great American West. The town had grown from a handful of weathered buildings to a bustling hub where fortunes were made and lost faster than a horse could change leads. At the heart of it all sat the Vexley Ranch, sprawling across 30,000 acres of the finest grazing land this side of the Mississippi. From her bedroom window on the second floor of the grand house her grandfather had built, Arabella Vexley could see clear to the mountains that rimmed their valley like the edges of a fine china plate. The view never failed to remind her of both her privilege and her burden. She touched the silver locket at her throat, feeling the familiar weight of the faded photograph inside her father at 25, standing proud beside his prize bull. Thomas Vexley had built this empire with his bare hands and an iron will, expanding on the foundation his own father had laid. Now at 28, Arabella found herself the sole heir to more wealth and responsibility than most people could imagine. The townspeople called her the Silver Queen, partly for the gleaming jewelry she favored, but mostly for the cool distance she maintained from their daily struggles. She paid her workers well, treated them fairly, and commanded their respect through competence rather than cruelty. But she had never learned the art of warmth, the simple human connection that might have made her wealth feel less like a fortress and more like a home. "Miss Arabella, you've got visitors." Jake Morrison's weathered face appeared in her doorway, his hat in his hands as always when he entered the house. At 62, Jake had been her father's foreman and now served as hers, one of the few constants in a life that had seen too much change too young. "Who is it this time, Jake?" She didn't turn from the window, watching the distant figures moving among the cattle. One rider sat differently from the others, straighter, more deliberate in his movements. Even from this distance, she recognized Calder Boone. "Preston Hartwell," Jake said, and she heard the slight distaste in his voice that he tried to hide. "Says he's got a business proposition for you." Arabella sighed, finally turning from the window. Preston had been calling twice a week since spring, armed with flowers, compliments, and increasingly transparent attempts to position himself as the solution to her unmarried state. At 34, he was considered quite the catch-handsome in a polished way, wealthy enough to court her as an equal, and possessed of the social graces that mattered to the wives of Ironwood Bluff's elite. "Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes." She smoothed her dark blue dress, checking her reflection in the mirror. Her father's eyes looked back at her, the same deep brown, the same hint of steel that had served him well in business dealings. Sometimes she wondered if she had inherited too much of his hardness and not enough of her mother's gentleness. The parlor smelled of the roses Preston had brought, their sweetness almost cloying in the afternoon heat. He rose when she entered, every inch the gentleman, his smile practiced and confident. "Arabella, you look radiant as always." He took her hand, holding it just a moment longer than propriety demanded. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced." "You know you're always welcome, Preston." The words came easily, trained into her by years of social obligation. She gestured to the settee, choosing the chair across from him, rather than sharing the more intimate seating. "I've been thinking about our conversation last month," he began, settling back with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. about the future of ranching in this territory, the advantages of consolidating holdings. Here it comes, she thought. Preston owned the second-largest spread in the county, and she had no doubt that combining their properties would create an empire that could dominate the cattle trade for generations. It would also solve the delicate problem of her unmarried state, providing her with a husband whose social standing would satisfy the community's expectations. The market's changing, Arabella. The big Eastern syndicates are buying up land, bringing in their own managers. Individual ranchers, even successful ones, are going to find it harder to compete. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Together, we could build something that would last for our children and grandchildren. She nodded thoughtfully, though her mind wandered to the rider she had seen from her window. Calder Boone had been working her land for 2 years now, and in that time he had quietly revolutionized their horse-breaking operation. Men who had been doing the job for decades admitted that he had a gift not just with the animals, but with understanding what each horse needed to reach its potential. "You make a compelling case," she said, forcing her attention back to Preston. "But I'm not sure I'm ready to make such a significant decision." His smile faltered slightly. "Arabella, forgive me for speaking plainly, but you can't run this ranch alone forever. You need a partner, someone who understands the business and can help you navigate the challenges ahead." The assumption in his words that she was incapable of managing alone rankled more than it should have. Her father had trained her well, and the ranch had prospered under her leadership. The books showed record profits for the past 3 years, and their reputation for producing quality cattle and horses continued to grow. "I appreciate your concern, Preston, but the Vexley Ranch has been quite successful under my management." Of course. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." He reached for her hand again, and this time she allowed it. "I'm simply saying that marriage to the right man could enhance what you've already built, provide you with companionship and support." Through the window, she could see the riders returning from the south pasture. Calder dismounted near the barn, his movements fluid despite his size. At 6'4", he stood a head taller than most men, but it was his quiet presence that set him apart. He never demanded attention, never raised his voice, but somehow everyone listened when he spoke. "I'll consider what you've said," she told Preston, though they both knew it was a polite dismissal rather than a promise. After he left, she found herself walking toward the barn, drawn by an impulse she didn't quite understand. The late afternoon light slanted through the open doors, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden air. Calder stood beside a young colt, speaking in low tones while his hands moved with gentle authority along the animal's neck. "How's he coming along?" she asked, stopping at a respectful distance. Calder looked up, touching the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "He's got spirit, but he's willing to learn. Give him another week, and he'll be ready for a saddle." His voice carried the trace of an accent she had never been able to place a note quite southern, not quite Midwestern. Like everything else about him, his past remained largely a mystery. He had arrived 2 years ago with nothing but his horse, his saddle, and a letter of recommendation from a rancher in Kansas who spoke of his abilities in terms that bordered on reverence. "I saw you working with the men in the south pasture today," she said. "Jake tells me you've been taking extra responsibility for security patrols. Rustlers hit the Patterson place last week. Seemed prudent to keep an eye on things." She nodded, appreciating both his initiative and his economy of words. Preston would have spent 10 minutes explaining his rationale, emphasizing his own wisdom and seeking praise for his foresight. Calder simply did what needed doing and moved on. "I want you to know that your efforts are noticed and appreciated." Something flickered in his grey-eye, surprise, perhaps, or simple acknowledgement. "Just doing my job, Miss Vexley." But they both knew it was more than that. In the 2 years since his arrival, Calder had become indispensable to the ranch's operation, not through ambition or self-promotion, but through the simple excellence of his work. The other men respected him, the horses trusted him, and even Jake had admitted privately that he had never worked with anyone quite like him. Standing there in the golden light of the barn, Arabella found herself studying the planes of his face, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the collar, the strength evident in his shoulders and hands. For just a moment, she allowed herself to wonder what it would be like to have a man look at her the way Calder looked at his horses, with patience, understanding, and the kind of gentle strength that coaxed the best from whatever it touched. The thought unsettled her more than Preston's business propositions ever could. That evening, as she sat alone in the dining room that could seat 20, Arabella reflected on the strange turn her thoughts had taken. She had built her life around control, certainty, and the careful management of expectations. The ranch required her complete attention, and she had convinced herself that personal happiness was a luxury she couldn't afford. But watching Calder work, seeing the easy competence with which he handled both animals and men, she began to wonder if she had been thinking about partnership all wrong. Preston offered her social acceptability and business expansion, but he also expected her to defer to his judgment, to become the ornamental wife of a powerful man, rather than the capable leader she had worked to become. Calder, on the other hand, had never once questioned her authority or suggested that she needed a man's guidance. He took his orders, offered his opinions when asked, and treated her with the same respectful professionalism he showed everyone else. In 2 years, he had never once tried to charm her, flatter her, or position himself for advancement. And perhaps that was exactly what made him so dangerous to the careful equilibrium she had built around her heart. The Vexley ranch deed lay in her father's old desk, the paper yellowed with age, but the words still clear. To Thomas Vexley and his heirs, in perpetuity, for the establishment of a lasting legacy in the territory of Montana. Her grandfather's signature sprawled across the bottom, a bold declaration of intent that had shaped 3 generations of her family. Legacy. The word carried such weight, such promise and burden combined. What kind of legacy was she building? What would future generations say about the woman who had inherited paradise and chosen to rule it alone? As she climbed the stairs to her room, Arabella caught sight of herself in the hall mirror. The Silver Queen, indeed beautiful, untouchable, and ultimately alone in her palace of prairie grass and mountain views. For the first time in years, she wondered if there might be another way to live, another way to honor her father's memory, while still claiming some measure of happiness for herself. Outside her window, the lights in the bunkhouse burned low as the men settled in for the night. Somewhere among them, Calder Boone was likely reading by lamplight or writing in the small journal she had occasionally seen him carry. What thoughts occupied his mind in the quiet hours? What dreams drove a man to work another's land with such dedication? Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and perhaps new insights into the puzzle that had become her life. But tonight, as she brushed her long dark hair and prepared for sleep, Arabella allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to trust someone completely, to share not just her bed or her name, but the weight of the choices that shaped each day. The silver locket lay on her nightstand, her father's young face smiling up from the faded photograph. "What would you do, Papa?" she whispered to the empty room. But the only answer was the sound of wind moving through the grass, carrying the sense of home and the promise of tomorrow's uncertainties. The barn dance on Saturday night was the social event of the month, drawing families from ranches scattered across 50 miles of territory. The Henderson barn had been swept clean and decorated with paper lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the wooden walls. Fiddle music filled the air, accompanied by the stomp of boots and the rustle of women's best dresses. Arabella stood near the refreshment table, wearing her finest emerald silk gown that complemented her dark hair and brought out the green flecks in her brown eyes. The silver locket at her throat caught the lamplight, drawing admiring glances from the unmarried men who had spent the evening working up courage to ask her to dance. She had obliged several of them, moving through the familiar steps of reels and waltzes with practiced grace. But her attention kept drifting to the far corner where Calder Boone stood with his back against the wall, watching the festivities with quiet observation rather than participation. He had cleaned up for the occasion, his hair neatly combed, his shirt pressed, his boots polished to a respectable shine. But even dressed for the dance, he maintained that air of separateness that had intrigued and frustrated her for 2 years. While other men pushed forward for her attention, Calder remained exactly where he was, as unmovable as a mountain. He's quite the mystery, isn't he? Preston appeared at her elbow, following her gaze across the crowded barn. Boone, I mean. 2 years he's been here, and nobody knows much more about him than when he arrived. He does his work well, Arabella replied carefully. That's what matters on a ranch. Is it, though? Preston's voice carried a note of something sharper than curiosity. A man's character matters as much as his competence, and character is built on openness, on being willing to share yourself with your community. The implied criticism stung because it carried a grain of truth. Calder's reserve did set him apart from the easy camaraderie of ranch life. He was respected, but not quite accepted, valued, but not entirely trusted. Perhaps some people have reasons for keeping their past private, she said, surprised by her own defense of him. Preston's eyebrows rose slightly. Perhaps, or perhaps some people have things to hide. Before she could respond, the fiddle struck up a lively reel, and Preston extended his hand with a confident smile. Shall we show them how it's done? She allowed him to lead her onto the makeshift dance floor, moving through the complicated steps with the ease of long practice. Preston was an excellent dancer, confident and sure-footed, leading her through turns and twirls that showed off both their skill and their compatibility as partners. But even as she smiled and laughed at his whispered comments, part of her awareness remained fixed on the quiet figure in the corner. Calder watched the dancing with the same intensity he brought to everything else, but his grey eyes never quite met hers. When the reel ended, Preston kept her hand in his, leading her toward the side of the barn where they could speak more privately. The evening air was cooler here, carrying the scent of hay and horses from the nearby corrals. "Arabella, I need to ask you something," he began, his tone more serious than she had heard before. "I've been patient, giving you time to consider my proposal, but I can't wait forever." She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the weight of expectations and social pressure that seemed to follow her everywhere. "Preston, I love you," he said, the words rushing out as if he had been rehearsing them. "I've loved you since we were children, and I believe I could make you happy. More than that, I believe we could build something lasting together." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and she felt a pang of guilt for the way her heart remained stubbornly unmoved by his declaration. Preston was everything she should want: handsome, successful, devoted to her. Their marriage would unite the 2 largest ranches in the territory and secure both their futures. "I care for you deeply," she said carefully. "You know that. But marriage is such a significant step. What more do you need to know about me? We've known each other our entire lives. Our families have been friends for generations. I can provide for you, protect you, give you the life you deserve." Through the open barn doors, she could see the dance continuing, couples whirling through the familiar patterns while the fiddle sang its ancient song of joy and connection. And still Calder stood apart, watching but not participating, present but not truly there. Something reckless stirred in her chest, a frustration with the careful calculations that governed her life, the constant weighing of duty against desire. Without fully understanding why, she found herself walking back into the barn, Preston following behind her. The music had paused between songs, leaving a moment of relative quiet, broken only by laughter and conversation. Arabella moved through the crowd with purpose, her silk dress rustling around her ankles, until she stood directly in front of Calder Boone. "Mr. Boone," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell over their immediate vicinity, "I don't believe I've seen you dance tonight." Calder straightened slightly, touching the brim of his hat in his customary gesture of respect. "Dancing's not much in my line, Miss Vexley." "No? And what is in your line exactly?" The words came out sharper than she had intended, edged with a frustration she couldn't name. Besides breaking horses and standing in corners, a murmur ran through the nearby dancers, sensing tension in the exchange. Calder's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his grey eye, surprise, perhaps, or disappointment. "I do my work," he said quietly. "Same as always." "Your work?" She laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Yes, you're very good at following orders, aren't you? Very reliable, very steady. But what else? What makes you different from any other hired hand?" The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the unusual spectacle of the Silver Queen engaged in public confrontation. Preston moved closer, his face a mask of concern and barely concealed satisfaction. "Arabella," he murmured, "perhaps we should." "No," she said, never taking her eyes off Calder. "I think it's time we had some honesty in this community. We all stand around pretending we know each other, making polite conversation and dancing our little dances. But what do we really know? What do any of us really offer?" Calder's hands hung loose at his sides, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself ready for whatever was coming. Still, his voice remained level when he spoke. "I'm not sure what you're asking of me, Miss Vexley. I'm asking what makes you think you belong here," she said, the words tumbling out with a momentum of their own. "What makes you think you have the right to stand there judging the rest of us with that superior silence of yours?" The accusation was unfair, and she knew it even as the words left her mouth. Calder had never displayed superiority or judgment, never shown anything but respectful competence in all their interactions. But something had broken loose inside her, a tide of frustration with the careful boundaries that governed every aspect of her life. "I don't judge anyone," Calder said, and for the first time she heard emotion creeping into his voice. "I just try to do right by the people who pay my wages." "The people who pay your wages," she repeated, seizing on the phrase. "Is that all we are to you? Just another job, another place to drift through until something better comes along?" "That's not. You think you're a man?" The words came from some deep well of hurt and confusion, aimed at the target of her own inexplicable fascination. "You think standing there all quiet and mysterious makes you special? Prove you're not worthless, give me 10 sons." The silence that followed was complete and devastating. Even the fiddle had stopped, leaving only the sound of her own harsh breathing and the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd. Calder stood perfectly still for a long moment, his face showing nothing of whatever was happening behind those grey eyes. Then, slowly, he reached up and touched the brim of his hat one final time. "Ma'am," he said quietly, and turned toward the barn door. The crowd parted before him like water, no one willing to meet his eyes as he walked with unhurried dignity toward the exit. Only when he reached the threshold did he pause, turning back to look at her across the span of faces and lamplight. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the barn. The laughter started slowly, nervous chuckles that grew into full-throated amusement as the crowd processed what they had witnessed. The Silver Queen had finally put the mysterious cowboy in his place, had shown him the distance between his station and hers in terms that everyone could understand. "Well," Preston said, his arm sliding around her waist in a gesture of possession and support, "I think that settles that question." But Arabella couldn't join in the laughter. She stood frozen in the center of the barn, watching the empty doorway where Calder had disappeared, feeling as if she had just torn something precious and irreplaceable with her own hands. The fiddle resumed its song, and couples began to form for the next dance. Life moved forward with the inexorable momentum of social expectation, carrying her along whether she willed it or not. Preston's hand guided her back onto the dance floor, and she moved through the familiar steps with mechanical precision. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the look in Calder's eyes, in that final moment, not anger, not wounded pride, but something far worse, disappointment. As if she had confirmed some suspicion he had hoped would prove unfounded. When the dance ended, she excused herself and stepped outside, needing air and space to think. The night was clear and cool, stars scattered across the dark canvas of the sky like diamonds on black velvet. In the distance, she could see the lights of various homesteads dotting the valley, each one a small beacon of human warmth in the vast darkness. She walked toward the corral where the horses waited patiently for their owner's return from the festivities. Her own mare, Luna, nickered softly in recognition, and Arabella moved to her side, finding comfort in the animal's simple, uncomplicated presence. "What have I done?" she whispered into Luna's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of horse and leather and home. From her pocket, she pulled the worn leather Bible she had found in the bunkhouse earlier that week while looking for Jake. She had meant to return it to whoever had left it behind, but curiosity had gotten the better of her. Inside, pressed between the pages like precious treasures, were wildflower sprayry roses, Indian paintbrush, lupins. In the margins, someone had written notes in a careful, educated hand, reflections on scripture, observations about the natural world, fragments of poetry that spoke of a soul far more refined than his rough exterior suggested. She had known immediately that it belonged to Calder, and the discovery had shaken her assumptions about the quiet cowboy more than she cared to admit. The man who carried this book, who pressed flowers between its pages and wrote thoughtful commentary on biblical passages, was not the simple hired hand she had tried to dismiss. Now, holding the Bible in the starlight, she felt the full weight of her cruelty. She had lashed out at him not because of any failing on his part, but because of her own confusion, her own inability to reconcile the feelings he stirred in her with the life she had planned. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. Preston emerged from the barn, his face concerned, but not entirely displeased. "There you are. People were beginning to wonder where you'd gone." "I needed some air." He moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring in the traditional way she had always appreciated. "You did the right thing in there, you know." Boone needed to understand his place, and sometimes that requires plain speaking. The certainty in his voice, the assumption that her cruelty had been justified, made her stomach turn. "Did I? Did I really do the right thing?" "Of course you did." The man was getting above himself, thinking he could court the Silver Queen just because he's handy with horses. "You put him back where he belongs." But that wasn't what had happened, and they both knew it. Calder had never courted her, never overstepped the bounds of professional respect, never done anything to deserve the public humiliation she had inflicted upon him. "I should go home," she said quietly, unable to bear any more of Preston's satisfied analysis of the evening's events. "I'll escort you, of course. And Arabella," he caught her hand as she turned toward her horse. "I hope tonight helped clarify things for you, about what kind of man deserves your consideration and what kind doesn't." She pulled her hand free with more force than necessary. "Good night, Preston." The ride home was a blur of moonlight and regret. By the time she reached the ranch house, the weight of what she had done had settled fully upon her shoulders. She had acted from wounded pride and confusion, lashing out at a good man who had done nothing to deserve her scorn. In her room, she sat before her mirror, still wearing the emerald dress that had seemed so fine just hours earlier. Now it felt like a costume, a beautiful facade that concealed the ugliness of her actions. The silver locket at her throat seemed heavier than usual, weighted with the disappointment her father would have felt at her behavior. Thomas Vexley had taught her many things about running a ranch, managing finances, and commanding respect. But he had also taught her about treating people with dignity, about the importance of fairness and integrity in all her dealings. Tonight, she had forgotten those lessons, and the knowledge burned like acid in her chest. Outside her window, the bunkhouse was dark and quiet. Somewhere in that building, Calder Boone was likely lying awake, processing the evening's humiliation and perhaps making plans to leave in the morning. The thought of his departure should have brought relief, should have simplified the confusion that had been growing in her heart for months. Instead, it filled her with a panic she didn't fully understand. Tomorrow would bring consequences for tonight's actions, choices that couldn't be undone with apologies or explanations. She had opened a door that might prove impossible to close, and the thought of what lay beyond it terrified her more than any business decision or social obligation ever had. The Silver Queen had spoken, and her words would echo through the community for months to come. But as she finally extinguished her lamp and lay down in the darkness, Arabella Vexley wondered if she had won a victory or suffered a defeat that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sunday morning brought no absolution, only the hollow ache of regret and the certainty that some words, once spoken, could never be taken back. Arabella woke before dawn, her sleep having been fractured by dreams of grey eyes and disappointed silence. She dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, hoping that the familiar routines of ranch management might provide some distraction from the memory of the previous night. Jake was already in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. He looked up as she entered, his weathered face carefully neutral in the way that meant he had something to say but wasn't sure how to say it. "Morning, Miss Arabella. You're up early." "Couldn't sleep." She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, grateful for something to occupy her hands. "How are the men this morning?" Jake's pause was telling. "Well, most of them are nursing sore heads from the dance. Henderson's corn liquor was particularly potent last night." "And Calder?" Another pause, longer this time. "He was up before me, working with that difficult colt in the north pasture. Been out there for 2 hours already." Relief and something else a disappointment, perhaps warred in her chest. Part of her had expected to find his bunk empty, his few belongings gone. His response to her cruelty, the dignified withdrawal of a man who knew when he wasn't wanted. But he had stayed, and more than that, he was working. "Jake, about last night." "Not my place to comment on what happened at the dance," the foreman said firmly. "But I will say this, Calder Boone is the finest horseman I've worked with in 40 years of ranching. Be ashamed to lose him over words spoken in anger." The gentle rebuke stung precisely because it was deserved. Jake had been her father's closest friend, and in the years since Thomas Vexley's death, he had served not just as foreman, but as a voice of conscience when her pride threatened to override her judgment. "I know," she said quietly. "I know what kind of man he is." "Do you?" Jake's blue eyes studied her with the patience of someone who had watched her grow from a headstrong child into an equally headstrong woman. "Because from where I stood last night, it seemed like maybe you'd forgotten." She couldn't argue with that assessment, so she didn't try. Instead, she finished her coffee and walked outside, breathing in the crisp morning air that carried the scent of grass and cattle and the promise of another hot day ahead. The ranch was already alive with activity despite the early hour. Cowboys moved through their morning routines with the easy efficiency of long practice, checking fences, tending to sick animals, preparing for another day of the endless work that kept 30,000 acres running smoothly. But her attention was drawn to the north pasture, where a solitary figure worked with a young horse in the golden light of sunrise. Even at this distance, she could recognize Calder's distinctive silhouette, the patient way he moved around the skittish colt, never forcing, never rushing, simply being present until the animal chose to trust. She found herself walking in that direction, drawn by impulses she didn't fully understand. The closer she got, the more clearly she could hear his voice, low, steady, reassuring words that seemed to reach something deep in the horse's instincts. "Easy now, boy. Nobody's going to hurt you. Just want to show you what a saddle feels like, that's all." The colt was magnificent to bay with white markings that would make him stand out in any herd. But he was also clearly traumatized, his eyes showing the wild fear of an animal that had learned to associate humans with pain. Most cowboys would have tried to break him with force, using ropes and strength to impose their will. Calder was doing something entirely different. He stood 15 feet away from the horse, holding a saddle blanket in his hands, but making no move to approach. Instead, he simply talked, his voice creating a steady stream of sound that gradually seemed to calm the animal's panicked breathing. "You've had some hard treatment, haven't you? Some fool thought he could make you submit by being cruel. But that's not how it works, is it? Real strength comes from choice, not force." The words hit Arabella like a physical blow, their relevance to her own behavior impossible to ignore. She stopped behind a fence post, using it to shield herself from view while she watched this patient lesson in respect and understanding. "See, the thing about trust is that it can't be demanded," Calder continued, taking a single step closer to the colt. It has to be earned, one moment at a time, one choice at a time. And it's fragile. You can destroy years of trust with one moment of cruelty. The horse's ears flickered forward, indicating interest rather than fear. Calder took another step, moving with the fluid grace that seemed so natural to him. "But here's the beautiful thing about forgiveness," he said, and now he was close enough to extend the blanket toward the horse's nose. "Sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you're willing to start over and prove you've changed, trust can be rebuilt. It takes time, and it takes consistency, but it's possible." The colt stretched his neck forward, nostrils flaring, as he investigated the unfamiliar scent of the blanket. Calder remained perfectly still, letting the animal make all the choices, controlling his own movements with a discipline that spoke of deep understanding. "That's it, boy. You decide what feels right. Nobody's going to force you into anything." Watching this display of patience and wisdom, Arabella felt something shift inside her chest, recognition of the kind of man she had publicly humiliated, the depth of character she had dismissed as mere hired help. This wasn't just skill with horses. This was a philosophy of life, a way of approaching relationships that was fundamentally different from the power dynamics she had always known. From her pocket, she pulled the small wooden horse she had found in the barn earlier that week. It was exquisitely carved, every detail perfect from the flowing mane to the delicate hooves. She had asked Jake about it, and he had mentioned that Calder sometimes whittled in the evenings, that he'd made several small toys for the children at the territorial orphanage. The image of this large, quiet man sitting by lamplight, carefully carving toys for children who had no family, added another layer to her growing understanding of who Calder Boone really was. He was not the simple cowboy she had tried to dismiss, not the worthless drifter she had accused him of being. He was a man of depth and compassion, someone who understood that real strength lay in gentleness, not dominance. "Miss Vexley." His voice startled her from her thoughts. She looked up to find that he had successfully placed the blanket on the colt's back and was now standing beside the animal, one hand resting gently on its neck. His grey eyes were calm but unreadable as they met hers across the pasture. "Mr. Boone." She stepped around the fence post, no longer hiding her presence. "I was watching you work. That's a beautiful horse. He will be, once he learns to trust again." The parallel was unmistakable, though his tone remained neutral. Someone used harsh methods on him before he came here. It'll take time to undo that damage. She moved closer to the fence, studying the way the colt stood quietly under the blanket, no longer showing signs of panic or fear. "How do you know it's possible? That he can learn to trust again, I mean." Calder's hand moved in slow circles on the horse's neck, and the animal leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "Every creature has the capacity for forgiveness, Miss Vexley. Sometimes they just need to see that the person asking for it has truly changed." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Arabella gripped the fence rail, feeling the rough wood under her palms as she searched for the right response. "Mr. Boone, about last night. No need to explain yourself to me, ma'am. You said what you felt needed saying." But his tone suggested that her words had indeed found their mark, that beneath his dignified exterior, the wound was still fresh. She wanted to explain about Preston's pressure, about her own confusion and the frustration that had been building for months. She wanted to tell him about the Bible with its pressed flowers, about the wooden horse that revealed his gentle heart, about the growing certainty that she had made a terrible mistake. Instead, she found herself asking, "Will you stay?" He looked at her directly then, and she saw something flicker in his grey eye, a surprise, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of hope. "Is that what you want, Miss Vexley?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. What did she want? To preserve the comfortable distance that had defined their relationship for 2 years. To apologize for her cruelty and return to the status quo. Or to acknowledge the truth that had been growing in her heart, despite all her attempts to deny it. "Yes," she said quietly, "I want you to stay." He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acceptance and a kind of cautious optimism. "Then I'll stay." The colt chose that moment to step forward, pressing his nose against Calder's shoulder in a gesture of complete trust. It was a small thing, but in the context of their conversation, it felt like a sign, a reminder that broken things could indeed be mended, given enough patience and care. "I should let you get back to your work," Arabella said, though she was reluctant to end this fragile moment of understanding. "Miss Vexley," his voice stopped her as she turned to go. "That was a fine dance last night. Before things got complicated. You move like your mother did." The observation caught her off guard. Her mother had died when she was 12, and few people ever mentioned the resemblance anymore. That Calder had noticed, had remembered Elizabeth Vexley's grace despite having never met her, suggested a attention to detail that went far beyond professional interest. "You knew my mother?" "No, Mum. But your father kept her portrait in his office, and sometimes he'd tell stories about her dancing at barn socials when they were young. Said she could make even a clumsy cowboy look graceful on the dance floor." The memory brought tears to her eyes, not of sadness, but of recognition. Her father had indeed loved to tell stories about her mother's grace, about the way she had transformed every gathering with her warmth and joy. That Calder had listened to those stories, had remembered them well enough to see the connection, spoke to a sensitivity she had never suspected. "Thank you," she said simply, "for remembering." As she walked back toward the house, Arabella felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of being truly understood by another person. Calder had seen past her public facade to the woman beneath, had recognized her not just as the Silver Queen, but as Elizabeth Vexley's daughter, Thomas Vexley's heir, a person with her own struggles and dreams. The wooden horse remained warm in her palm, a tangible reminder that the man she had tried to dismiss was far more complex than she had allowed herself to acknowledge. He created beauty in his spare time, gave comfort to orphaned children, and approached every living creature with a patience and respect that she was only beginning to understand. Perhaps, if she was very careful and very honest, there might be a way to rebuild what her pride had nearly destroyed. Perhaps forgiveness was indeed possible for both of them. The days that followed the barn dance settled into a careful rhythm of professional courtesy and unspoken understanding. Arabella found herself more aware of Calder's presence than ever before, noticing the small kindnesses that had always been part of his character, but which she had previously overlooked or dismissed as mere competence. She watched him spend his lunch break teaching young Tommy Henderson how to properly curry a horse, his large hands guiding the boy's smaller ones with infinite patience. She observed him sharing his dinner with the ranch's old border collie, Max, who had developed a habit of following Calder around like a devoted shadow. These moments of quiet compassion revealed a man whose heart was far larger than his reserved exterior suggested. 3 days after the dance, trouble arrived in the form of dust clouds on the eastern horizon. Jake spotted them first, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the signs of riders approaching fast and hard. By the time the group reached the main house, word had already spread through the ranch. The Patterson place had been hit again, and this time the damage was far worse than anyone had imagined. 30 heads stolen, Jim Patterson said, his weathered face grim as he dismounted from his lathered horse. But that ain't the worst of it. They burned the barn, ran off all the horses, and left a message carved into my front door. Arabella felt her blood run cold. Rustling was a constant threat in cattle country, but arson and intimidation tactics suggested something far more organized and dangerous than opportunistic thieves. "What did the message say?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "Said this is what happens to ranchers who don't cooperate. Said next time it'll be the house with the family inside." The implications were clear and terrifying. This wasn't random crime, it was systematic intimidation designed to force ranchers into some kind of compliance. But compliance with what? "We need to organize a response," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of frontier experience. "Can't let something like this go unanswered, or they'll think they can hit any ranch in the territory." Arabella nodded, her mind already working through the logistics of defense and retaliation. The Vexley Ranch was the largest and most prosperous in the area, which made it both a tempting target and a natural leader in any organized response to the threat. "We'll need to coordinate with the other ranchers," she said. "Pool our resources, share information, make sure everyone knows what we're dealing with." "I can ride to the neighboring spreads," one of the cowboys offered. "Get word out about a meeting." But before anyone could respond, Calder stepped forward from where he had been standing at the edge of the group. His presence was quiet but commanding, and something in his demeanor made everyone turn to listen. "If I may, Miss Vexley," he said, his voice carrying a note of authority she had never heard before. "This kind of organized activity, the timing, the tactics, the intimidation methods has the feel of military precision." The observation was astute and troubling. If the rustlers were using military tactics, it suggested leadership with actual combat experience, which would make them far more dangerous than ordinary cattle thieves. "You think they're ex-soldiers?" Jake asked, his respect for Calder's opinion evident in his tone. "Could be, or it could be someone with experience in irregular warfare. Either way, we're not dealing with simple opportunists. This is planned, coordinated, and designed to escalate until they get what they want." "And what do they want?" Arabella asked, though she suspected the answer would be nothing good. "Control," Calder said simply. "They want to own the territory through fear, force the smaller ranchers to sell out or pay protection money. Eventually, they'll consolidate power until they control the entire cattle trade in this area." The strategy was both simple and effective. By targeting the most vulnerable ranches first, the criminals could build momentum and resources while terrorizing the larger operations into submission. It was exactly the kind of systematic approach that had worked in other territories where law enforcement was weak and distances made coordination difficult. "So what do we do?" Patterson asked, his voice carrying the desperation of a man who had already lost too much. Calder looked to Arabella, waiting for her permission before offering his advice. The gesture was small but significant, a recognition of her authority, even as he demonstrated knowledge that went far beyond typical ranch work. "Mr. Boone has experience in these matters," she said, making her trust in his judgment clear to everyone present. "I'd like to hear his recommendations." Something shifted in Calder's posture, a subtle straightening that suggested he was drawing on knowledge and skills that had been dormant for some time. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had faced similar challenges before. "First, we need to gather intelligence, find out everything we can about their numbers, their base of operations, their patterns of movement. Second, we organize a defense network, coordinated patrols, communication systems, rapid response capabilities. Third, we make it clear that attacking any ranch in this territory will bring consequences they can't afford." The plan was sound, but it would require cooperation on a scale that the independent-minded ranchers of the territory had never attempted before. Arabella could see the doubt in Patterson's eyes, the uncertainty about whether proud men would be willing to subordinate their individual interests to collective defense. "I'll host a meeting tomorrow night," she said, making the decision with the kind of quick resolve that had served her well in business. "Every rancher within 50 miles. We'll share information, coordinate our response, and make sure everyone understands what we're facing." The next 24 hours were a whirlwind of preparation and planning. Word spread quickly through the territory, carried by riders who understood the urgency of the situation. By evening, the Vexley ranch house was filled with more people than it had seen since her father's funeral ranchers, their foremen, and trusted hands who had been chosen to represent smaller operations. Arabella stood at the front of the room, wearing her mother's wedding ring for the first time since her death. She had retrieved it from her jewelry box that morning, drawn by impulses she didn't fully understand, but which felt important in the face of what lay ahead. The ring was simple but elegant, a gold band, set with a modest diamond that caught the lamplight with quiet fire. Elizabeth Vexley had worn it through 20 years of marriage, through the challenges of building a ranch from nothing, through the joys and sorrows that had defined her life with Thomas. Now, As Arabella faced a room full of worried men, she drew strength from the connection to her mother's memory, from the reminder that the women of her family had always stood strong in the face of adversity. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded room, "we all know why we're here. The attacks on the Patterson Ranch represent a threat to every operation in this territory. But more than that, they represent a challenge to our way of life, to the principles of independence and self-reliance that brought us all to this frontier." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. These were men who had left civilization behind to build something new in the wilderness, who understood that their freedom depended on their willingness to defend it. "Mr. Boone has analyzed the situation and believes we're dealing with an organized military-style operation," she continued. "Calder, would you share your assessment?" The transition felt natural, a seamless passing of authority that acknowledged both her position as ranch owner and his expertise in matters of security and tactics. Calder stepped forward, and she noticed how the room's attention focused on him with the kind of respect that couldn't be demanded, but had to be earned. "What we're seeing isn't random crime," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "The timing of the attacks, the specific targets chosen, the escalation from theft to arson and intimidation, all of it suggests centralized planning and experienced leadership." He moved to the large map of the territory that Arabella had hung on the wall, pointing to the locations of recent incidents. "Look at the pattern. They're starting with the most isolated ranches, the ones that can't call for help quickly. They're testing response times, gathering intelligence about our capabilities, and building their reputation for ruthlessness." The logic was clear and terrifying. What had seemed like random acts of criminality were actually the opening moves in a calculated campaign of conquest. "The good news," Calder continued, "is that military tactics can be countered with military strategy. If we coordinate our efforts, share information quickly, and respond as a unified force, we can make the cost of attacking any ranch higher than they're willing to pay." "Easy to say," grumbled Frank Morrison, whose small spread bordered the Badlands where the rustlers were believed to be hiding. "But my place is 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. By the time help arrives, they could burn me out and be long gone." "Which is why we need a communication system," Calder replied. "Signal fires on high points, messenger routes between ranches, designated riders who can spread word quickly. And we need rapid response, groups of men who can ride to any threatened location within hours, not days." The plan was ambitious, requiring levels of cooperation and sacrifice that went against the fierce independence that defined frontier life. But as Calder outlined the detailed patrol schedules, supply caches, predetermined rally points, Arabella could see understanding dawn in the faces around the room. "There's something else," Calder said, his tone growing more serious. "These aren't just cattle thieves. They're trying to control the entire territory, which means eventually they'll come for the biggest prize." His eyes met Arabella's across the room. "The Vexley Ranch represents everything they want to own or destroy." The implication sent a chill through the gathering. If the criminals were indeed following a systematic plan, then Arabella's ranch wasn't just another potential target, it was the ultimate objective. The symbol of independent prosperity they needed to break in order to establish their dominance. "Then we make our stand here," she said, the decision forming as she spoke. "We use the Vexley Ranch as the center of our defensive network. Anyone who needs refuge, anyone whose property has been attacked, can come here. We have the resources to support a large group and the defensible position to make a fight of it." The offer was both generous and strategic. By positioning herself as the leader of the resistance, Arabella was accepting enormous risk, but also providing the kind of central authority that any successful defense would require. "That's asking a lot of you, Miss Vexley," said Ben Carter, whose respect for her had grown considerably over the past hour. "These men won't stop until they control everything, and that makes you their primary enemy." "Then let them come," she replied, surprised by the fierce satisfaction in her own voice. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather fought Blackfoot warriors to establish this ranch, and my father built it into something worth fighting for. I'll be damned if I let a gang of criminals take it without a fight." The response was immediate, and powerful nods of approval, murmurs of support, the kind of energy that transforms individual fear into collective resolve. These men understood the language of courage and commitment, and Arabella's willingness to risk everything had earned their complete respect. As the meeting broke up and plans were made for implementing the defensive network, Arabella found herself standing beside Calder as they studied the map together. The others had begun to leave, riding back to their ranches with new purpose and the knowledge that they were no longer facing the threat alone. "That was well done," Calder said quietly. "Your father would have been proud of the way you handled that." The compliment meant more to her than all the business success and social recognition she had achieved. Coming from him, it felt like validation, not just of her leadership, but of her character. "I couldn't have done it without your expertise," she replied. "Where did you learn about military tactics?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His grey eyes grew distant, focused on memories that were clearly painful. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of experiences she could barely imagine. "The war," he said simply. "I served with the Union cavalry for 4 years. Saw enough irregular warfare to recognize the patterns." The admission explained so much: his quiet authority, his strategic thinking, the way he carried himself with the unconscious discipline of a soldier. But it also raised new questions about the experiences that had shaped him, the battles he had fought, and the losses he had endured. "It must have been difficult," she said, offering understanding rather than curiosity, "coming home from something like that." "The difficult part wasn't coming home," he replied, his voice growing softer. "It was figuring out how to live with what I'd seen, what I'd done. Sometimes the peace is harder than the war." The honesty in his words, the vulnerability he was showing her, felt like a gift. This was the man behind the reserved exterior, the soldier who had become a cowboy, not through lack of ambition, but through a conscious choice to find healing in simple, honest work. From her finger, she twisted her mother's wedding ring, feeling its familiar weight and the memories it carried. The gesture drew Calder's attention, and she saw his eyes focus on the simple gold band with recognition and understanding. "Your mother's?" he asked gently. "Yes. I wore it today because I wanted to feel connected to her strength. She and my father faced their own challenges in building this place, and I thought maybe wearing her ring would help me find the courage they would have wanted me to have." Calder nodded, his expression thoughtful. "She would have been proud too, I think. Takes real courage to put yourself between your community and the kind of danger we're facing." The words, spoken with such quiet conviction, settled something restless in her heart. For weeks, she had been struggling with questions about her identity, about whether she was living her own life or simply playing a role others expected of her. But tonight, standing beside this man who understood both leadership and sacrifice, she felt more like herself than she had in years. "Calder," she said, using his given name for the first time. "Thank you for staying, for your help with all this, for being patient with me." His smile was small but genuine, transforming his usually serious features into something warmer and more approachable. "We all make mistakes when we're trying to figure out who we are, Arabella. The measure of a person isn't in never-failing, it's in how they choose to make things right." The use of her name, spoken with such gentle understanding, sent warmth spreading through her chest. This was forgiveness offered not through grand gestures, but through simple acceptance, the kind of grace that made healing possible. As they stood together in the lamplight, studying the map that would guide their defense of everything they held dear, Arabella felt the last of her pretenses falling away. Whatever happened in the days ahead, she would face it not as the untouchable Silver Queen, but as a woman who had found the courage to fight for what mattered most: land, her people, and perhaps, if she was very fortunate, the love of a man who understood that true strength came from gentleness, not force. The defensive network proved its worth within a week. Signal fires blazed from hilltops across the territory as the Morrison Ranch came under attack. and by the time the raiders had finished their work, 30 armed men were converging on the location from all directions. The rustlers fled rather than face an organized response, leaving behind only minor damage and the knowledge that their easy victories were at an end. But success came with a price. The constant vigilance required to maintain the network was wearing on everyone, and Arabella found herself relying more heavily on Calder's military expertise with each passing day. He had quietly assumed responsibility for coordinating the defense efforts, and she watched with growing admiration as he transformed a collection of independent-minded ranchers into something resembling a disciplined fighting force. It was during one of their evening strategy sessions that she made the discovery that would change everything between them. Calder had left his saddlebags in her father's study while they worked on patrol schedules, and when she moved them to clear space for the maps, one of the bags fell open, spilling its contents across the floor. Most of what scattered was mundane extra ammunition, leather-working tools, a few personal items wrapped in oiled cloth. But among the possessions was a small leather portfolio tied with string, and when it fell open, a photograph slipped out onto the wooden planks. Arabella picked it up without thinking, then froze as she realized what she was looking at. The image showed a younger Calder, in full Union cavalry uniform, standing beside a horse with his arm around a woman of extraordinary beauty. The woman wore a simple dress that couldn't hide her elegant figure, and her smile radiated the kind of joy that spoke of deep happiness. On the back of the photograph, in Calder's careful handwriting, were the words, "Calder and Margaret Boone, wedding day, 1863. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Calder had been married, had loved someone enough to make her his wife, had known the kind of intimacy and partnership that Arabella had always told herself she was too busy to want. And from the way he kept the photograph, wrapped carefully among his most precious possessions, it was clear that he loved her still. "Find something interesting?" His voice from the doorway made her jump guiltily. She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read, his grey eyes taking in the scattered contents of his saddlebags and the photograph in her hands. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, setting the image on the desk and stepping back. "Your bag fell open when I moved it, and I was just looking at my private belongings." There was no anger in his voice, but something harder than disappointment. "I suppose a ranch owner has the right to investigate her employees." The casual reference to their professional relationship stung more than any accusation could have. In the past week, she had begun to think of him as something approaching an equal, a partner in the defense of their community. To have him retreat behind the formality of their respective positions felt like a door slamming shut. "It wasn't like that," she said, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Calder moved past her to collect his scattered possessions, his movements efficient and controlled. When he reached for the photograph, she noticed that his hands were completely steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Margaret," she said quietly, reading the name from the back of the image. "She was beautiful." He paused in his gathering, the photograph held carefully between his fingers. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't respond, that he would simply pack his things and leave. But when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of memory that made her chest ache. "She was everything good in the world," he said simply. "Smart, kind, brave enough to marry a soldier during wartime. I thought we'd have 50 years together." The past tense was answer enough, but Arabella found herself needing to know more. What happened? Calder was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one required effort to voice. "Cholera, in the winter of 1864. I was away on campaign, fighting in Virginia. By the time I got word and made it home, she'd been dead for 3 weeks. He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that spoke of a grief too deep for tears. I never even got to say goodbye." The simple statement carried more pain than any dramatic declaration could have conveyed. Arabella found herself imagining the young cavalry officer returning from battle to find his world destroyed, his future erased by disease and distance and the cruel timing of war. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the inadequacy of the words painful in themselves. "That's why I came west," he continued, as if her sympathy had unlocked something that had been held back for years. "Couldn't stay in Ohio, couldn't stand the memories. Thought maybe if I went far enough, worked hard enough, I could outrun the guilt." Guilt? The word surprised her. "But you couldn't have prevented what happened. You were serving your country." "I chose the war over her," he said flatly. "When my enlistment was up, I could have come home, should have come home. But I believed in the cause, thought my duty to the Union was more important than my duty to my wife." He carefully placed the photograph back in the leather portfolio, his movements gentle despite the pain in his voice. "Margaret understood. She always understood. But understanding doesn't change the fact that I wasn't there when she needed me most." The revelation explained so much about the man she had been trying to understand for 2 years. His reserve, his reluctance to form close attachments, his dedication to work as a form of penance, all of it made sense in the context of a love lost and a guilt that had never been resolved. "How long has it been?" she asked gently. 21 years this winter." He finished packing his belongings, each item placed with careful precision. 21 years of telling myself that the work is enough, that serving others honorably is a kind of redemption. And is it? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Calder straightened, shouldering his saddlebags with the same economical grace that marked all his movements. "I thought so," he said quietly, "until recently." Before she could ask what had changed, what had made him question the careful equilibrium he had built around his grief, he was moving toward the door. But he paused at the threshold, turning back to look at her with an expression that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "I know what people think about me," he said. "The mysterious drifter with no past, no attachments, no real stake in anything, and mostly I've been content to let them think it. But you should know what happened at the dance. The way you spoke to mate didn't hurt because I'm proud. It hurt because I'd started to hope that maybe there was still room in my life for something more than just getting by." The admission left her breathless, not just for what it revealed about his feelings, but for the courage it must have taken to voice. This was a man who had spent more than 2 decades protecting himself from further loss, and yet he was willing to risk vulnerability for the possibility of connection. "Calder, wait." But he was already gone, leaving her alone, with the weight of his confession and the growing certainty that she had been asking all the wrong questions about her own life. She had spent so much time wondering whether she was strong enough to run the ranch alone, successful enough to justify her father's faith in her, attractive enough to command Preston's devotion. She had never stopped to ask whether she was brave enough to love a man whose heart had been broken by forces beyond his control, wise enough to recognize that true partnership required vulnerability, and generous enough to accept that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to hope again. From her jewelry box, she retrieved the bundle of letters she had discovered weeks earlier, correspondence between Calder and his late wife that had somehow ended up mixed with ranch documents. She had known she should return them, but curiosity and something deeper had made her hold on to them. Now, reading Margaret Boone's words by lamplight, she began to understand the depth of what Calder had lost. The letters revealed a woman of intelligence and strength, someone who had supported her husband's military service while building a life of her own as a teacher and community leader. "My dearest Calder," one letter began, "I know you worry about being away so long, about the dangers you face and the time we lose while you serve. But please know that every day you spend fighting for our country's future is a day that makes me prouder to be your wife. When this war ends, we will build something beautiful together, a family, a home, a life worthy of the sacrifices we're making now." The words were poignant enough on their own, but knowing that Margaret had died before those dreams could be realized made them heartbreaking. No wonder Calder carried such guilt, such reluctance to risk his heart again. He had already lost everything once through circumstances beyond his control. But as she read further, Arabella began to see something else in the Letticer woman's fierce belief in her husband's capacity for love, her conviction that his heart was strong enough to survive whatever trials lay ahead. "You have so much love to give," Margaret had written in what was apparently her final letter. "Promise me that if something happens to me, you won't let that love die with me. The world needs men like you, Caldermen who understand that true strength comes from gentleness, that real courage lies in vulnerability. Don't let grief turn you into someone smaller than you are." The words seemed to leap off the page, carrying a message from beyond the grave that spoke directly to Arabella's growing understanding of the man she had dismissed as worthless just weeks earlier. Margaret Boone had seen her husband's true nature, had recognized the depth of character that others missed because they were looking for flash rather than substance. As she carefully refolded the letters, Arabella made a decision that both terrified and exhilarated her. Tomorrow, she would find Calder and return his wife's correspondence. But more than that, she would tell him what she had learned about herself in the process of trying to understand him. She would tell him that love didn't require the absence of grief, that healing didn't mean forgetting, and that sometimes the greatest honor you can pay to a lost love is to remain open to the possibility of finding it again. Dawn came with the sound of hoofbeats and shouting voices, shattering the peaceful quiet of the ranch like a gunshot through glass. Arabella woke instantly, the bundle of letters still clutched in her hand from where she had fallen asleep at her desk. Through her window, she could see riders approaching fast. Jake and two of the patrol riders, their horses lathered and their faces grim with urgency. She dressed quickly and ran downstairs, arriving in the yard just as Jake was dismounting. His weathered face was pale beneath his tan, and when he looked at her, she saw something she had never seen before in the old foreman's eyes: fear. "They hit us," he said without preamble. "The north pasture. Took 200 head and burned the line shack, but that ain't the worst of it." Her blood turned to ice. "What happened?" "They left another message, carved it right into the door of the shack before they torched it." Jake's voice was steady, but she could hear the effort it cost him. "Tell the Silver Queen her time is up. Next week we come for the house." The words hit her like physical blows. This wasn't just another raid, it was a direct declaration of war, a personal challenge that made her the primary target of whatever these criminals were planning. "Where's Calder?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Already out there with a tracking party. Soon as we sent word, he grabbed 6 men and headed north. Said he wanted to see the scene while the trail was still fresh." She nodded, grateful for his quick thinking, even as worry gnawed at her chest. If the raiders were becoming this bold, this personal in their threats, then they had moved beyond simple theft into something far more dangerous. "Send word to the other ranchers," she said, falling back on the practical necessities of leadership. "Emergency meeting tonight, and double the guards around the house and barns. If they're planning to come here next week, we need to be ready." The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Men arrived throughout the morning, neighboring ranchers, trusted cowhands, even some of the townspeople who had decided that their interests lay with organized resistance rather than criminal submission. By noon, the Vexley ranch looked more like a military encampment than a cattle operation. It was mid-afternoon when Calder returned with his tracking party, their faces set in the kind of grim determination that spoke of discoveries nobody wanted to hear. He dismounted near the house and walked directly to where Arabella stood, coordinating the defensive preparations, his grey eyes holding information that would change everything. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Privately." She followed him into her father's study, closing the door behind them and turning to face whatever revelation had put that look of controlled fury in his eyes. He moved to the window, staring out at the organized chaos in the yard while he gathered his thoughts. "It wasn't random," he said finally. "The raid, the message, the timing, none of it was random. They knew exactly where to hit, when the guards would be rotating, which routes would give them the best escape options. The implication was clear and terrible. Someone told them. Someone who knows our defensive plans, our patrol schedules, our weak points. He turned from the window to face her, and she saw that his soldiers' training had reasserted itself. This wasn't Calder, the cowboy, speaking. This was Captain Boone of the Union Cavalry, analyzing an enemy threat with professional detachment. Someone who's been in our planning meetings. The betrayal was worse than the physical attack. To know that someone they trusted, someone who had sat in her parlor and heard their strategies, had sold that information to the enemy, made her feel sick to her stomach. "Who?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "I can't prove it yet," Calder said carefully. "But there's only one person who had access to all our information and who would benefit from our failure. Preston." The name hung unspoken between them, heavy with implication and the bitter taste of betrayal. Preston, who had courted her for months, who had presented himself as the solution to her unmarried state, who had access to her home and her confidence and all the details of their defensive network. "He wants the ranch," she said, the pieces falling into place with horrible clarity. "If the rustlers destroy me, drive me out, or force me to sell, he could buy the property for a fraction of its value. And marry the territory's most eligible widow in the process," Calder added grimly. "Assuming you survived the experience, which I'm beginning to doubt, was part of his plan." The cold calculation of it took her breath away. Preston had been willing to orchestrate attacks on their neighbors, to put families at risk, to threaten her lawful for the chance to possess what he couldn't win through honest courtship. "What do we do?" she asked, surprised by how calm her voice sounded despite the rage building in her chest. "We give him what he wants," Calder said, and something in his tone made her look at him more closely. "Or rather, we make him think we're giving him what he wants." The plan he outlined was elegant in its simplicity and terrible in its risks. They would use Preston's betrayal against him, feeding him false information about when and where they would be most vulnerable. Instead of the easy target he expected, he would find a carefully prepared trap designed to catch not just the raiders, but their ally within the community. "It's dangerous," Calder warned. "If we're wrong about Preston, or if the timing goes bad, you could be killed. These men aren't playing games anymore. They've moved from theft to intimidation to direct threats against your life." She thought about Margaret Boone's letters, about the courage it had taken for that young woman to support her husband's military service, knowing the risks involved. She thought about her father's stories of the early days, when every decision carried the potential for disaster, but also the possibility of building something lasting and valuable. "I'm not backing down," she said firmly. "This is my land, my home, my responsibility. If Preston thinks he can terrorize me into submission or marriage, he's about to learn otherwise." Calder studied her face, and she saw something shift in his expression, recognition, perhaps, of the steel beneath her polished exterior. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly, "and so would my Margaret. She always said the measure of a person wasn't whether they felt fear, but what they chose to do despite it." The reference to his late wife, spoken without the usual careful distance, felt like a gift. He was trusting her not just with the plan, but with his memories, his pain, and his slowly rebuilding capacity for hope. "Calder," she said, reaching into her desk drawer for the bundle of letters she had been carrying. "These belong to you. I found them mixed in with ranch documents, and I should have returned them immediately. I'm sorry I kept them so long." He took the letters with hands that weren't quite steady, recognizing them immediately despite the years that had passed. For a moment, she thought he might be angry at her intrusion into such private grief. Instead, he looked up at her with something approaching gratitude. "You read them." "Some of them. I know I shouldn't have, but—" She struggled for words to explain the compulsion that had driven her to seek understanding of this complex man. "I wanted to understand who you really were, beneath all the reserve and professional distance." "And what did you learn?" The question was asked without accusation, with genuine curiosity about her conclusions. She chose her words carefully, knowing that this moment would define whatever relationship was possible between them. "I learned that you loved her completely, and that she loved you the same way. I learned that grief doesn't make someone smaller unless they choose to let it." and that carrying the memory of a great love isn't the same thing as being unable to love again. She met his eyes directly, letting him see the truth of her growing feelings. I learned that Margaret was a wise woman who understood that your heart was strong enough to survive even the worst losses. Something changed in his face as she spoke her, softening, a cautious hope that transformed his usually serious features into something warmer and more approachable. She was wise, he agreed quietly, wiser than I gave myself credit for being able to find again. The admission hung between them, heavy with possibility and the fragile beginning of something neither had expected to want. But before either could say more, a commotion in the yard drew their attention back to the window. A rider was approaching at full gallop, and even at a distance they could see the urgency in his movements. As he drew closer, Arabella recognized him as one of the men they had posted as lookouts on the southern ridge. "Miss Vexley," he called as he dismounted, "you need to see this. They're moving in force at least 50 riders, all armed, heading this way from the Badlands." The final confrontation was coming sooner than anyone had expected. Instead of waiting for next week, as their message had promised, the raiders were attacking now, while the ranch was full of allies and the defensive preparations were at their strongest. "It's a trap," Calder said, understanding immediately. "Preston told them about the meeting, about all the ranchers being here. They're not just coming for you, they're coming for everyone at once." The realization was both terrifying and clarifying. This would be the decisive battle, the moment when their improvised alliance would either hold together or shatter under the pressure of real combat. Everything they had built, everything they hoped to protect, would be decided in the next few hours. "Then we'd better be ready for them," Arabella said, surprised by the calm determination in her own voice. "Time to see if all our planning was worth anything." As they moved toward the door, Calder caught her arm gently, stopping her for just a moment. "Arabella," he said, using her given name with a tenderness that made her heart race. "When this is over, when we've dealt with Preston and his hired guns, I'd like to talk to you about what comes next. About whether there might be room in your life for a man who's finally ready to stop running from his own heart." The declaration, made in the shadow of impending battle, was both perfectly timed and completely inappropriate, but it filled her with a warmth and strength that no amount of preparation could have provided. "I'd like that too," she said simply. "But first, let's make sure we both survive to have that conversation." His smile was small but genuine, the expression of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for beyond duty and guilt and the need to atone for past failures. Outside, the ranch was transforming into a fortress, with men taking positions behind makeshift barricades and checking their weapons with the grim efficiency of soldiers preparing for war. The peaceful cattle operation had become something else entirely, a symbol of resistance against the kind of lawlessness that threatened to consume the entire territory. As Arabella stood beside Calder, watching their allies prepare for the fight ahead, she felt her mother's wedding ring warm against her finger and her father's strength flowing through her blood. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it not as the untouchable Silver Queen, but as a woman who had finally learned the difference between loneliness and solitude, between safety and happiness, between existing and truly living. The raiders were coming, and she was ready. The attack never came. As the sun set over the Vexley ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, 50 armed men waited behind barricades that had been built for nothing. The lookouts reported no movement from the Badlands, no dust clouds on the horizon, no sign of the massive force that had supposedly been heading their way. It was Jake who first voiced what everyone was beginning to suspect. "Maybe the scout was wrong," he said, his weathered face creased with confusion. "Maybe what he saw wasn't raiders at all." But Calder was already moving, his soldier's instincts recognizing a tactical deception when he saw one. "Where's the man who brought the warning?" he asked, his voice carrying a new edge of suspicion. They found the scout's horse tied behind the barn, still saddled, but with no sign of its rider. A search of the immediate area revealed nothing except tracks leading away from the ranch tracks that suggested a man leaving in a hurry rather than staying to help defend against the threat he had reported. "It was a lie," Arabella said, the pieces falling together with horrible clarity. "Someone wanted us all gathered here, armed and ready for a fight that was never coming. But why?" The answer came in the form of distant smoke, visible as a dark smudge against the darkening sky. One of the men with field glasses called out the devastating news. "Fire at the Patterson place. Looks like the house is going up." Within minutes, similar reports came from lookouts positioned around the territory. The Morrison Ranch was burning. The Carter place showed signs of recent attack. While every able-bodied man in the territory had been gathered at the Vexley Ranch preparing for a battle that never came, the real raiders had struck everywhere else at once. The tactical brilliance of it was undeniable and terrifying. By creating a false alarm that concentrated all their defensive forces in one location, the criminals had left every other ranch in the territory completely undefended. In a single evening, they had effectively destroyed the network of mutual protection that had taken weeks to establish. "We've been played," one of the ranchers said, his voice heavy with bitter recognition. "Played like children." Calder was already moving toward his horse, his face set in lines of grim determination. "We need to split up, check on every ranch, see what's left. Some of those families might still be alive and needing help." But before anyone could mount up, a new voice cut through the chaosa voice that made Arabella's blood run cold with recognition and rage. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Preston Hartwell emerged from the shadows near the barn, no longer the polished gentleman who had courted her for months. His clothes were dusty from hard riding, his face was flushed with excitement, and in his hand was a document that seemed to glow in the lamplight. "Preston," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "I should have known." "Should have known what, my dear? That I was smart enough to see an opportunity when it presented itself." He moved closer, confident in a way that suggested he held all the advantages. "You always were too proud for your own good, Arabella. Too convinced of your own superiority to see what was happening right under your nose." Behind him, more figures emerged from concealment, not the masked raiders they had been expecting, but men Arabella recognized from town. Shopkeepers, clerks, even the bank manager, all armed and all looking at her with the kind of greed that made her stomach turn. "Let me guess," Calder said, his voice carrying the cold authority of his military training. "You organized the raids to drive down property values, then used your connections to buy up the damaged ranches for pennies on the dollar." "Close, but not quite right," Preston replied, his smile sharp as a blade. "I didn't buy the ranches, I foreclosed on them. You see, most of these independent operators have been borrowing against their property to fund improvements, buy cattle, expand their operations. And when their herds started disappearing, when their buildings started burning, they couldn't make their loan payments." He held up the document in his hand, and Arabella could see now that it was a deed official, legal, bearing the territorial seal. "The beautiful thing about fear," Preston continued, "is how it makes people desperate. Desperate enough to sign over their property rights in exchange for protection that never came. Tonight, while you were all playing soldier, my associates were collecting signatures from families who suddenly realized they had nothing left to lose." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. Preston hadn't just organized the rage, she had used them as leverage to force desperate ranchers into signing away their life's work. Legal theft on a massive scale, hidden behind a facade of business transactions and loan defaults. "And now," he said, his eyes fixed on Arabella with predatory intensity, "we come to the crown jewel of the territory. The Vexley Ranch, with its 30,000 acres of prime grazing land, its water rights, its strategic location. Do you know what this property is worth, my dear? What it would be worth to the right buyer with the right connections?" From his coat, he produced another document, this one bearing her father's signature and the official seal of the Territorial Land Office. Arabella's heart stopped as she recognized it. "Impossible," she whispered. "That deed is locked in the safe in my father's study." "Was locked," Preston corrected with evident satisfaction. Amazing how easy it is to get into a house when you know the family's routines, when you have keys made during your many social visits, when you understand exactly when the owner will be distracted by other concerns. The forged land deed, a worst nightmare made manifest. The document in Preston's hands claimed to show that her father had secretly mortgaged the ranch years earlier, using it as collateral for loans that had never been repaid. According to the false paperwork, the Vexley Ranch now belonged to a consortium of investors represented by Preston Hartwell. "You can't possibly think this will work," Calder said, his voice carrying dangerous calm. "Forgery is a hanging offense in this territory, and there are 50 witnesses here who know exactly what you've done." Preston's laugh was genuinely amused. "Witnesses? You mean the men who attacked my associates and threatened the peace of this community? The vigilantes who took the law into their own hands instead of trusting in proper legal procedures?" He gestured to his companions, all of whom were now openly displaying badges that identified them as territorial marshals. "I'm afraid you're the criminals here, gentlemen. Resisting legal authority, threatening lawful business operations, conspiring to obstruct justice." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with sickening clarity. Preston hadn't just corrupted local official, she had infiltrated the territorial government itself, placing his allies in positions of legal authority that would allow them to legitimize their theft through official channels. "The beauty of the American legal system," he continued, clearly enjoying his moment of triumph, "is that possession is 9/10 of the law. I have legal documents, territorial authority, and a legitimate claim to this property. What do you have?" The word of a bunch of cowboys and an unmarried woman who's clearly been overwhelmed by responsibilities too large for her delicate constitution. The casual dismissal of her capabilities, the assumption that her gender made her legally and intellectually inferior, ignited a rage in Arabella's chest that burned hotter than any emotion she had ever experienced. This was the man who had pretended to love her, who had sat in her parlor and listened to her dreams, who had used her trust to orchestrate the destruction of everything her family had built. "You're forgetting something, Preston," she said, her voice steady despite the fury coursing through her veins. "I'm not some helpless widow dependent on male protection. I'm Thomas Vexley's daughter, and I learned more about law and business by the time I was 16 than you'll understand in your entire miserable life." She reached into her coat and withdrew a document of her own that made Preston's confident expression falter for the first time since his dramatic revelation. "What you have there is indeed a forgery," she continued, "but not a very good one. You see, my father was meticulous about his record-keeping, and every legitimate document in his files was recorded in his personal ledger with specific details about when it was signed, witnessed, and filed. The supposed loan agreement you've based your claim on, it's dated 3 months after my father's death. The mistake was small but fatal. In his eagerness to create legal justification for his theft, Preston had overlooked the kind of detail that separated genuine documentation from criminal fraud. Moreover," Arabella continued, pulling out a second document, "this is a copy of my father's will, properly witnessed and filed with the territorial court. It specifically states that the Vexley Ranch is to remain in family hands in perpetuity, with clear legal language preventing any sale or mortgage that would compromise its integrity. Even if your forged loan documents were genuine, they would be legally invalid under the terms of my inheritance." Preston's face had gone pale, but his eyes still held the desperate cunning of a cornered animal. "Legal technicalities won't save you, Arabella. I have the territorial marshals, I have the backing of powerful men in the capital, and I have 50 armed supporters ready to enforce my claim. Your paperwork is meaningless against superior force." "Is it?" Calder asked quietly, and something in his tone made everyone turn to look at him. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a leather portfolio that Arabella had never seen before. Inside were documents that bore official seals and signatures not territorial but federal. "Captain Calder Boone, United States Army, retired," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to command. special investigator for the Department of Justice, assigned to investigate reports of organized crime and territorial corruption in the Montana Territory. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Calder hadn't come to the Vexley ranch as a drifting cowboy seeking work. He had come as a federal agent, investigating the very conspiracy that Preston had been orchestrating. For 2 years, I've been documenting criminal activities, gathering evidence, building cases against corrupt officials and their associates, he continued, his grey eyes fixed on Preston with professional intensity. Everything you've done, every crime you've committed, every life you've destroyed, it's all been recorded, witnessed, and reported to federal authorities. Preston's confident facade crumbled completely. That's impossible. You're a cowboy, a hired hand. I'm a United States Army officer who served with distinction in the Civil War and who has spent the past 5 years working undercover investigations for the federal government. Calder corrected. And you, Preston Hartwell, are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and treason against the United States. The word treason fell like a physical blow. Under territorial law, the crimes Preston had committed might result in prison time. Under federal law, with charges of treason added to the list, he was looking at the gallows. The men with you aren't territorial marshals, Calder continued, producing another set of documents. They're impersonating federal officials, which is itself a capital crime. The real marshals are currently arresting your associates throughout the territory, using evidence I've been gathering for months. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses filled the air. But these weren't raiders or criminals, they were United States cavalry, riding under federal colors and led by an officer whose uniform bore the insignia of a major. "Captain Boone," the major called as he dismounted, "we have all the conspirators in custody. The territorial governor has been arrested, along with 6 other officials who were part of the conspiracy. The fake marshals surrendered without resistance once they realized they were facing federal charges." Preston stood frozen, his world collapsing around him with the methodical precision of military justice. The conspiracy that had seemed so perfect, so legally unassailable, had been nothing more than an elaborate trap designed to catch him and his associates in the act of committing federal crimes. "You planned this," he said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "All of it. The defensive network, the meetings even." His eyes fixed on Arabella with sudden, terrible understanding. "Even your rejection of my proposals, you knew." "I suspected," she admitted. "But I didn't know for certain until tonight. Calder told me about his real identity just before your dramatic entrance." The timing had been perfect. Calder's revelation of his true mission, followed immediately by Preston's attempt to steal her ranch, all witnessed by 50 of the territory's most respected citizens and documented by federal agents. "The ironic thing," Calder said, his voice carrying a note of professional satisfaction, "is that your criminal conspiracy actually made my job easier. By gathering all the corrupt officials in one place, by forcing them to reveal themselves through their actions, you provided exactly the evidence the federal government needed to clean up this entire territory." Preston looked around desperately, searching for some escape route, some final card to play. But he was surrounded by federal cavalry, witnessed by dozens of honest citizens, and facing charges that would ensure he never saw freedom again. "Take him away," the major ordered, and 2 soldiers stepped forward to place Preston in shackles. As the former suitor was led away, still protesting his innocence and demanding to speak to lawyers who would never be able to help him, Arabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. The threat was over. Her ranch was safe. The man she was falling in love with had revealed himself to be not just honorable but heroic. And the future, which had seemed so uncertain just hours earlier, now stretched ahead full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine. But as she looked at Calder, Captain Boone of the United States Army, realized that this revelation changed everything between them. He wasn't the simple cowboy she had grown to love. He was a federal agent whose work would inevitably take him away from the ranch, away from her, away from any chance they might have had at building something lasting together. The victory was complete, but it might also be the end of everything she had hoped to find with the man who had captured her heart through patience, courage, and the kind of quiet strength that came from serving something larger than himself. The aftermath of Preston's arrest brought a strange quiet to the Vexley ranch. The federal cavalry had departed with their prisoners. The neighboring ranchers had returned to survey the damage to their own properties, and the organized chaos of defense preparations had given way to the normal rhythms of ranch life. But beneath the surface calm, Arabella struggled with emotions she couldn't name and questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Calder Captain Boone had remained behind to complete his official reports and coordinate with federal authorities about the ongoing investigation. She watched him work in her father's study, his familiar form bent over documents that would ensure justice for all the families who had suffered under Preston's conspiracy. But the easy companionship they had built over weeks of planning and shared danger felt different now, complicated by revelations that changed everything she thought she understood about their relationship. "The federal prosecutor will want to interview you next week," he said, without looking up from his writing. "Your testimony about Preston's courtship behavior, his access to ranch information, his knowledge of our defensive plans will be crucial for establishing the conspiracy charges." His voice was professional, courteous, but lacking the warmth that had developed between them during the crisis. She recognized the distance for what it was, a man pulling back from personal attachments as he returned to his official duties. "Of course," she replied, keeping her own tone equally neutral. "Whatever the government needs." But what she wanted to ask had nothing to do with legal proceedings. She wanted to know if any of it had been real, their growing closeness, his admission about being ready to hope again, the moment before the final confrontation when he had spoken of wanting to discuss their future together. Or had it all been part of his cover story, an undercover agent maintaining his disguise by playing the role of the interested cowboy? Jake appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing concern that went beyond the usual worries of ranch management. "Miss Arabella, there's something you need to see. Found it in the ruins of the Patterson place when I rode over to check on the family." He held out a small objector cavalry saber, its blade blackened by smoke, but its brass guard still gleaming. Even before she looked closely, she knew what she would find etched into the metal. "Captain C. Boone, 3rd Ohio Volunteer Cavalry," she read aloud, her voice catching slightly on the words. Calder looked up from his reports, his grey eyes taking in the weapon with recognition and something deeper connection to memories that were clearly painful. "My father's sword," he said quietly. "I thought it was lost when Margaret died. I had to sell most of our possessions to pay for her medical care and the funeral expenses. Preston must have had it," Jake said, his voice heavy with understanding. "Must have bought it somewhere along the way and kept it as some kind of trophy. Found it thrown in the ruins like it was worthless." The symbolism was unmistakable and cruel. Preston had possessed this token of Calder's family history, his military service, his connection to his late wife, and had discarded it among the wreckage of his crimes like garbage. It was a final insult from a man who had tried to destroy everything that represented honor and integrity in their community. Calder took the sword with hands that weren't quite steady, running his fingers along the familiar grip and testing the balance of the blade. For a moment, he seemed transported to another time, another place where this weapon had meant the difference between life and death. "My father carried this through the Mexican War," he said, his voice distant with memory. "Gave it to me when I enlisted, said it would keep me safe and remind me what I was fighting for. Margaret used to polish it every Sunday while I was away, said it was her way of keeping part of me close." The image of a young woman caring for her husband's sword while he fought in a distant war was almost unbearably poignant. Arabella could picture Margaret Boone in her modest home, maintaining this symbol of her husband's service as an act of love and faith. "She wanted me to pass it on to our son someday," Calder continued, his grip tightening on the weapon. "Wanted it to be part of a legacy we'd build together." The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, grief made fresh by the physical reminder of dreams that had died with cholera in a winter long past. Arabella felt her heart breaking for him, for the family he had never been able to create, for the legacy that had ended with one woman's death in an empty house. "Maybe," she said carefully, "it's not too late for that kind of legacy." He looked at her directly then, and she saw in his eyes the same uncertainty that had been plaguing her since his true identity was revealed. They were both trying to navigate the shift from the simple attraction between a ranch owner and her employee to something far more complex, the relationship between a federal agent and a witness in his investigation, between a man bound by duty and a woman whose life was rooted in the land he would inevitably have to leave. "Arabella," he began, then stopped, clearly struggling with words that carried too much weight for casual conversation. Before he could continue, the sound of an approaching rider interrupted them. Jake moved to the window, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the urgency in the newcomer's posture. "It's Billy Hartwell," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Preston's nephew. He's riding hard." The young man who dismounted in their yard bore a strong resemblance to his uncle, but where Preston had cultivated an air of sophisticated menace, Billy showed only the desperate fear of someone whose whole world was collapsing. He couldn't have been more than 20, and the terror in his eyes was genuine and heartbreaking. "Miss Vexley," he called as he approached the house, "please, I need to speak with you. It's about my uncle, about what he's done to my family." Arabella exchanged glances with Calder, recognizing the possibility that this might be another trap, another manipulation designed to exploit their compassion. But the boy's fear seemed too real to dismiss, and his willingness to come to them openly suggested something other than criminal intent. "What do you need, Billy?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. "My uncle, he's destroyed everything," the young man said, his words tumbling out in a rush of desperation. "The family ranch, my inheritance, my sister's dowry, used it all to fund his conspiracy. Said it was an investment, that we'd all be rich when he controlled the territory. But now that he's been arrested, the federal government is seizing everything connected to his crimes." The implication was clear and tragic. In his greed for power and wealth, Preston had destroyed not just his intended victims, but his own family, leaving innocent relatives destitute and connected to crimes they had never chosen to commit. "My sister, she's only 17, Miss Vexley. She's got nowhere to go, no way to support herself. And it's worse than that." Billy's voice dropped to a whisper, his shame evident in every word. "Before he was arrested, my uncle made arrangements. Contracts with men in the territorial capital, agreements that would ensure my sister's cooperation in settling the family's debts." The words hit like physical blows. Preston had arranged to sell his own niece into what amounted to slavery, using her as collateral for debts incurred in his criminal conspiracy. It was a level of depravity that made even his other crimes seem almost civilized by comparison. "Where is she now?" Calder asked, his military training reasserting itself as he processed the tactical implications of the situation. "Hidden at the old McBride place, about 10 miles north, but the men my uncle made deals with, they know she's there. They're coming for her tomorrow night, and I can't stop them alone." The request for help was implicit but unmistakable. Billy was asking them to risk their own safety to save a girl who had been victimized by circumstances beyond her control, to stand against men who had no legal authority but plenty of willingness to use violence. "We'll help," Arabella said without hesitation, the decision forming as she spoke. "No one deserves what Preston has arranged for your sister." Calder studied her face, recognizing the determination that had driven her to defend the ranch, to stand up to Preston's intimidation, to fight for everything she believed in. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of his federal commission and something deeper personal conviction about what was right. "This is federal jurisdiction now," he said, reaching for his official documents. "Any attempt to collect on those illegal contracts would constitute kidnapping and human trafficking under federal law. I have the authority to stop it." But even as he spoke, they all understood the reality of the situation. Federal authority meant little in the remote wilderness where Preston's associates operated, and a single agent, however well trained, would be outnumbered by men who had nothing left to lose. "We'll need help," Jake said practically. "Good men who understand what we're facing and are willing to fight for something besides their own interests." The old foreman was right, but finding such men wouldn't be easy. The other ranchers were dealing with their own recovery from Preston's crimes. The townspeople were scattered and demoralized, and the federal cavalry had moved on to other assignments. "I know where to find them," Arabella said, surprising everyone, including herself. "The men who came to the ranch for our defense meetings, they didn't just come to protect their own property. They came because they believe in something bigger than individual survival. If we explain what's at stake, what kind of evil we're trying to stop, they'll come." It was a gamble based on her faith in human decency, her belief that the men who had answered her call for mutual defense would also answer a call to protect an innocent girl from unspeakable exploitation. But as she looked at the cavalry saber in Calder's hands, at the symbol of honor and service that had been rescued from the ruins of Preston's crimes, she felt certain that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. "There's something else you should know," Billy said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "My uncle, before he was arrested, he sent word to his contacts in the capital. Told them that if anything happened to him, they should take revenge on the people who brought him down." His eyes fixed on Arabella with genuine regret. "You're in danger, Miss Vexley. More danger than you know." The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. Even with Preston in custody, his criminal network was still active, still capable of striking back at the people who had exposed their conspiracy. Saving Billy's sister would be an act of justice, but it would also make them targets for retaliation by men who had demonstrated their willingness to commit any crime for profit. "Let them come," Calder said quietly, and when he looked at Arabella, she saw not the reserved cowboy she had first known, or even the federal agent who had revealed his true mission, but something else, entirely a man who had found something worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth risking everything to keep safe. "We've faced worse odds than this," she replied, thinking of the barn dance that seemed like a lifetime ago, of the cruel words she had spoken and the patient forgiveness he had offered in return. "And we've learned that some things are more important than safety." As they began planning their response to this new crisis, Arabella felt the last of her doubts about Calder's feelings fall away. Federal agent or cowboy, his commitment to justice and his growing love for her were both genuine. The question now wasn't whether their relationship could survive the revelation of his true identity, but whether either of them would survive the final confrontation with Preston's legacy of evil. The cavalry saber gleamed in the lamplight, a reminder that some battles couldn't be avoided, only won or lost. Tomorrow night would determine not just the fate of an innocent girl, but the future of everything they had built together, their love, their community, and their shared belief that honor was worth any sacrifice. The town bell began ringing at dawn, its bronze voice carrying across the valley with urgent insistence. By the time the sun cleared the eastern mountains, riders were converging on Ironwood Bluff from every direction, ranchers who had survived Preston's conspiracy, townspeople who had been freed from his economic intimidation, and federal agents who understood that justice required more than paperwork and courtrooms. Arabella stood on the church steps, watching the gathering crowd with a mixture of hope and trepidation. These were the people she had grown up among, whose respect she had earned through years of fair dealing and community leadership. But what she was asking of them now went beyond business relationships or social obligations. "Friends," she called as the crowd settled into expectant silence, "you know why we're here. Preston Hartwell's crimes didn't end with his arrest. His associates in the territorial capital have threatened retaliation against everyone who stood against their conspiracy, and they've already begun with an act so vile that it demands immediate response." She gestured to Billy Hartwell, who stood beside her with the kind of shame that came from bearing a criminal's name despite having committed no crimes himself. The young man's presence was both an asset and a liability proof of the danger they faced. but also a reminder that not everyone connected to Preston was necessarily guilty. Billy's sister has been sold into slavery by her own uncle, she continued, letting the stark words hang in the morning air. Tonight, men will come to collect her as payment for Preston's debts. If we allow this to happen, if we fail to act when we have the power to prevent such evil, then we become complicit in her destruction. The crowd stirred with anger and disgust. These were people who had built their lives on principles of freedom and self-determination, who had come west to escape the kinds of corruption and exploitation that thrived in more civilized places. The idea of allowing slavery, even the unofficial kind Preston had arranged to exist in their territory, violated everything they believed in. "What are you asking of us?" called out Ben Carter, his weathered face showing the caution of a man who had already lost too much to criminal violence. Before Arabella could answer, Calder stepped forward, and she saw how the crowd's attention immediately focused on him. Word of his true identity had spread quickly through the community, and the revelation that their quiet cowboy was actually a federal agent had transformed their perception of him completely. "We're asking you to stand with us one more time," he said, his voice carrying the authority of both his military training and his moral conviction. Not as vigilantes or criminals, but as citizens executing a lawful rescue operation under federal authority. "I have the legal power to arrest the men who are planning to kidnap Billy's sister, but I need your help to do it safely." The distinction was important. This wouldn't be mob justice or frontier revenge, but a legitimate law enforcement operation conducted by a federal agent with proper authority. The men who participated would be acting as deputized civilians, not outlaws. "The girl is hidden at the old McBride place," Calder continued, unrolling a map of the area. "It's isolated, defensible, but surrounded by rough country that gives us several advantages. We can position ourselves to intercept the kidnappers before they reach her, use the terrain to negate their superior numbers, and ensure that no innocent people are harmed in the process." Jake Morrison stepped forward from the crowd, his presence lending weight to the discussion. "How many men are we facing?" "Billy estimates 12 to 15, Calder replied. "Professional criminals, well-armed, and desperate enough to take significant risks. They know that failure will likely mean federal prosecution for kidnapping and human trafficking." The odds weren't terrible, but they weren't good either. 15 experienced criminals against whatever volunteers they could muster from the community would be a challenging fight under the best circumstances. "I'll go," said Frank Morrison, his voice cutting through the murmur of discussion. "My daughter's about the same age as Billy's sister. If someone was planning to do that to her, I'd want every decent man in the territory to stand against it." The declaration opened the floodgates. One by one, men stepped forward to volunteer, some motivated by moral outrage, others by loyalty to Arabella or respect for Calder, all unified by the conviction that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. Within an hour, they had 23 volunteers, enough to ensure numerical superiority while still maintaining the mobility and coordination necessary for the kind of operation Calder was planning. But as the men dispersed to gather weapons and supplies, Arabella found herself facing a different kind of challenge. "You're not going," Calder said quietly, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had already made an irrevocable decision. "This isn't a discussion, Arabella. You're staying here where it's safe." The assumption of authority, the casual dismissal of her right to participate in decisions that affected her own life, ignited the same fierce independence that had driven her to challenge him at the barn dance weeks earlier. "I most certainly am going," she replied, her voice carrying the steel that had intimidated businessmen and politicians for years. "That girl is in danger because of her connection to Preston, and Preston targeted me specifically because of what my ranch represents. This is my fight as much as anyone's." "Your fight was organizing the community, providing leadership when people needed it most," Calder said, his grey eyes showing the kind of protective concern that was both touching and infuriating. "You've done your part. Now let the rest of us do ours." But she could see through his reasoned arguments to the fear underneath, not fear for the mission's success, but fear for her personal safety. He had already lost one woman he loved to circumstances beyond his control, and the thought of risking another loss was clearly more than he could bear. "Calder," she said gently, using his given name to emphasize the personal nature of their conversation. "I understand why you want to protect me, but I need you to understand why I can't let you." From her coat, she withdrew her father's pocket watcher family heirloom that had been passed down through 3 generations of Vexley men. The gold case was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the inscription inside read simply, "Time passes, honor endures." "My grandfather carried this through the Indian Wars," she said, holding the watch so that it caught the morning sunlight. "My father carried it through the early days of building this ranch, when every decision could mean the difference between success and failure. Now it's my turn to carry it, to live up to the legacy it represents." She pressed the watch into Calder's hands, feeling the warmth of his fingers as they closed around the precious metal. "I'm not asking you to risk my life carelessly or to treat me as just another soldier in your operation. I'm asking you to trust me enough to let me stand beside you when it matters most." The gesture was both practical and symbolic. By giving him her father's watch, she was entrusting him with her family's most precious legacy, while simultaneously asserting her right to participate in shaping its future. "Arabella." "No," she interrupted, her voice carrying the quiet finality of absolute conviction. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove that I was worthy of the responsibility my father left me. I've succeeded in business. I've earned the respect of this community. I've shown that a woman can lead as effectively as any man. But if I stay behind while others fight for what's right, if I let fear or convention keep me from standing up for my principles, then I'll have proven that I was never worthy of the Vexley name at all." The argument was unanswerable because it went to the heart of who she was, what she had spent years building, and what she was willing to sacrifice to maintain her integrity. Calder studied her face, and she could see him recognizing the same stubborn determination that had driven her to defend her ranch, to stand up to Preston's intimidation, to fight for everything she believed in. "If you go," he said finally, "you follow my orders without question. This is a military operation, not a community meeting, and hesitation or argument could get people killed." The concession was grudging but genuine, offered by a man who understood that some battles couldn't be won through protection alone. She nodded her acceptance, knowing that his conditions were reasonable and necessary for everyone's safety. "One more thing," he added, his voice dropping to the intimate tone he used only when they were alone. "When this is over, when we've saved Billy's sister and dealt with Preston's associates, I want that conversation we talked about what comes next, about whether there's room in your life for a man whose work sometimes takes him away from home." The promise, made in the shadow of approaching danger, filled her with warmth and determination in equal measure. Whatever happened in the hours ahead, they would face it together, as partners in both the immediate crisis and the larger question of their shared future. As the volunteer force gathered at the edge of town, checking weapons and reviewing the rescue plan one final time, the bell fell silent. Its bronze voice had done its work, calling the community together for one last stand against the forces that threatened everything they held dear. The ride to the McBride place would take them through country that was both beautiful and dangerous, past landmarks that held memories of better times, and toward a confrontation that would determine whether justice or criminality would define their territory's future. But as Arabella swung into her saddle, feeling the familiar weight of her father's Colt revolver at her hip and the equally familiar presence of Calder beside her, she felt ready for whatever lay ahead. Some fights were worth the risk, some principles were worth any sacrifice, and some loves were strong enough to survive even the worst that life could offer. The confrontation came at sunset, painting the sky in shades of fire that seemed to mirror the violence about to unfold. From their position in the rocks above the McBride place, Arabella watched Preston's associates approach with the methodical precision of men who had done this kind of work before. They moved in formation, weapons ready, showing none of the hesitation or moral uncertainty that might have made them vulnerable to surprise. 15 men, just as Billy said, Calder murmured beside her, his voice carrying the calm authority of military command. They're professionals, probably ex-soldiers like me, men who've turned their training to criminal purposes. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. These were men who had once served their country with honor, who had sworn oaths to protect the innocent and uphold justice. Now they were riding to collect a 17-year-old girl as payment for her uncle's debts, prepared to destroy her life for money that was already tainted with blood. "Signal the others," she whispered, watching as the riders dismounted near the abandoned farmhouse where Billy's sister waited in hiding. "It's time." The plan Calder had devised was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than meet the criminals in direct combat, they would use the terrain and their superior numbers to create a situation where surrender was the only rational choice. No unnecessary bloodshed, no risk to the innocent girl they were trying to save. Just overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The confrontation came at sunset, painting the sky in shades of fire that seemed to mirror the violence about to unfold. From their position in the rocks above the McBride place, Arabella watched Preston's associates approach with the methodical precision of men who had done this kind of work before. They moved in formation, weapons ready, showing none of the hesitation or moral uncertainty that might have made them vulnerable to surprise. 15 men, just as Billy said, Calder murmured beside her, his voice carrying the calm authority of military command. They're professionals, probably ex-soldiers like me, men who've turned their training to criminal purposes. The irony was bitter and unmistakable. These were men who had once served their country with honor, who had sworn oaths to protect the innocent and uphold justice. Now they were riding to collect a 17-year-old girl as payment for her uncle's debts, prepared to destroy her life for money that was already tainted with blood. "Signal the others," she whispered, watching as the riders dismounted near the abandoned farmhouse where Billy's sister waited in hiding. "It's time." The plan Calder had devised was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than meet the criminals in direct combat, they would use the terrain and their superior numbers to create a situation where surrender was the only rational choice. No unnecessary bloodshed, no risk to the innocent girl they were trying to save. Just overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. But as the volunteers moved into position around the farmhouse, Arabella realized that something was wrong. The criminal's leader, a tall man, with the bearing of a former cavalry officer, was studying the surrounding rocks with the kind of tactical awareness that suggested he wasn't as surprised by their presence as he should have been. "They know we're here," she breathed, her heart sinking as she recognized the implications. Calder's jaw tightened as he reached the same conclusion. Someone warned them. Someone told them about our plan. The betrayal was devastating, but not entirely unexpected. Preston's network had included men throughout the territory, and despite the arrests, it was clear that some of his associates remained free and active. The question now was whether their tactical advantage could overcome the enemy's forewarning. "What do we do?" she asked, her hand moving instinctively to the grip of her father's revolver. "We adapt," Calder replied, his military training reasserting itself as he processed the changed situation. "The mission remains the same: save the girl, stop the criminals, minimize casualties. But now we do it the hard way." He raised his rifle and fired a single shot into the air, the prearranged signal for the attack to begin. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and suddenly the quiet evening erupted into chaos. The criminals responded with immediate, disciplined fire, their shots aimed at the muzzle flashes of the volunteers' weapons rather than random locations. These were indeed professional soldiers, men who knew how to fight outnumbered and had the skills to make every bullet count. But the volunteers had advantages beyond numbers. They were fighting for their families, their community, and a cause they believed in completely. When Jake Morrison rose from behind a boulder to return fire, his weathered face showed the same determination that had driven him through 40 years of frontier challenges. "Federal agents." Calder's voice boomed across the battlefield, carrying both authority and warning, You're surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now and you'll be treated according to law." The response was a volley of rifle fire that sent chips of stone flying from the rocks around them. Whatever these men had been promised for completing their mission, it was apparently worth more to them than their lives. Arabella found herself pressed against a granite outcropping, her heart hammering as bullets whined overhead. The reality of combat was nothing like the romanticized stories she had heard. It was chaos, terror, and the constant awareness that death could come from any direction at any moment. "Stay down," Calder ordered, his own rifle speaking with methodical precision as he targeted the criminals' positions. "This isn't like dealing with rustlers or intimidating merchants. These men are killers." But even as he spoke, she could see that the tide of battle was turning in their favor. The volunteers might lack military training, but they had superior positions, greater numbers, and the kind of moral certainty that gave men courage when courage was needed most. One by one, the criminals' weapons fell silencing through death, others through wounds that made fighting impossible. By the time full darkness fell over the canyon, only 3 of the original 15 remained capable of resistance. "Last chance," Calder called out. "Surrender now or face the consequences." The answer came not in words, but in the sound of horses galloping away into the night. The surviving criminals had chosen retreat over certain death, abandoning their mission and their wounded comrades in favor of escape. "Let them go," Calder said when several volunteers moved to pursue. "Our job was to save the girl, not hunt down every criminal in the territory. That's what courts and prisons are for." The wisdom of his restraint became clear as they moved toward the farmhouse. Inside, they found Billy's sister, a slight, dark-haired girl, whose eyes showed the kind of terror that came from understanding exactly what fate she had been saved from. "Sarah," Billy said, gathering his sister into his arms with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had almost lost everything that mattered. "It's over. You're safe now." But even as they celebrated the successful rescue, Arabella found herself studying Calder's face in the lamplight. The battle had been won, the girl was safe, and justice had been served. Yet something in his expression suggested that this victory came with costs she didn't fully understand. "What happens now?" she asked, as they prepared to leave the farmhouse behind. "Now the law takes its course," he replied, his voice carrying the detached professionalism she had learned to recognize as his way of protecting himself from emotional attachment. "The surviving criminals will be hunted down and prosecuted. The girl will be placed under federal protection until permanent arrangements can be made. And I'll file my final report on the Preston Hartwell conspiracy." The word "final" hit her like a physical blow. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question. She could see the truth in his carefully neutral expression, in the way he avoided meeting her eyes directly. Captain Calder Boone of the United States Army had completed his mission, and now duty called him elsewhere. "My assignment here is finished," he said quietly. "The corruption has been exposed, the criminals are dead or captured, and the territory is safe from the kind of organized crime that brought me here in the first place." She wanted to argue, to point out that safety was fragile and that his work here could continue in a dozen different ways. But she could see that his mind was already made up, that the same sense of duty that had made him an effective agent now compelled him to move on to other missions, other communities that needed his particular skills. From her coat, she withdrew his father's cavalry saber weapon they had recovered from the ruins of Preston's crimes. The blade gleamed in the firelight, its brass guard reflecting the flames like captured gold. "This belongs to you," she said, offering him the symbol of his family's military heritage. "Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished here, and so would Margaret. You've honored their memory in the best possible way." Calder took the sword with hands that trembled slightly, the weight of it clearly carrying significance beyond its physical mass. For a moment, she thought she saw his resolve waver, saw him considering the possibility of staying, of choosing personal happiness over professional duty. But when he looked up at her, his grey eyes had regained their military composure. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. For understanding why I had to deceive you about who I was, for trusting me when it mattered most, for being brave enough to fight beside me when lesser people would have stayed safe at home." The praise was genuine but felt like a farewell, a way of honoring what they had shared while simultaneously ending it. She wanted to rage against his choice, to demand that he consider what he was giving up in the name of duty. Instead, she found herself thinking of Margaret Boone's letters, of a woman who had supported her husband's service even when it meant separation and sacrifice. "Where will you go?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the pain building in her chest. "Dakota Territory, most likely. There are reports of organized rustling operations there, the kind of criminal conspiracy that requires federal intervention." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "It seems there's always another territory that needs cleaning up, another community that needs protection from men like Preston Hartwell." The noble purpose of his work was undeniable, but it offered little comfort to a woman who had finally learned the difference between safety and happiness, between existing and truly living. She had found love with a man whose heart belonged not just to her, but to a larger mission that would always take precedence over personal desires. "I understand," she said, and meant it. "I understand why you have to go, and I want you to know that I'm proud of you for choosing duty over personal comfort. That's the kind of man my father would have respected, the kind of man worthy of the love Margaret gave you." As they rode back toward town, the rescued girl safe among them and the criminal's threat finally ended, Arabella felt the peculiar mixture of triumph and loss that seemed to define all the most important moments in life. They had won a complete victory against forces that threatened everything they held dear, but the cost of that victory was the end of the most meaningful relationship she had ever known. The watch her father's watch remained in Calder's possession, a tangible reminder of the trust she had placed in him and the legacy he had helped her protect. Tomorrow he would leave Ironwood Bluff forever, carrying that timepiece toward whatever new mission awaited him in the endless work of building justice on the American frontier. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Arabella stood in the same spot where she had once mocked Calder Boone for his quiet strength. The barn had been rebuilt after Preston's final act of spittia fire, set by one of his remaining associates just days before the man's capture. But the new structure was larger, stronger, designed not just for ranch work, but as a gathering place for the community that had emerged from the ashes of corruption and fear. Today, it would host the most important celebration Ironwood Bluff had seen in years. "Miss Arabella?" Jake's voice interrupted her thoughts, drawing her attention to the elderly foreman who had become not just an employee, but a treasured friend in the months since Calder's departure. "The guests are starting to arrive. You ready for this?" She touched the new brand design that had been burned into the barn's main beamer symbol that combined the traditional Vexley family mark with something entirely new. It represented not just her ranch, but the network of alliances and mutual protection that had grown from their struggle against Preston's conspiracy. "As ready as anyone can be for something they never expected to want," she replied, smoothing the blue silk dress that had been her mother's wedding gown, carefully altered to fit her own figure while preserving its original elegance. The months since the final confrontation had brought changes she could never have imagined. Billy Hartwell had proven himself an excellent ranch hand, working with desperate determination to redeem his family name through honest labor. His sister Sarah had recovered from her trauma enough to accept a position as the territorial schoolteacher, her ordeal having given her a fierce commitment to protecting other vulnerable young people. Most surprisingly, the community had chosen Arabella as their territorial representative to the state capitala position that would require her to spend several months each year in political work, fighting for the interests of ranchers and farmers against the kind of corporate corruption that had nearly destroyed them all. It was work that would take her away from the ranch periodically, work that required the same kind of courage and dedication she had shown in fighting Preston's conspiracy. But it was also work that could make a lasting difference for families throughout the territory. "Riders coming in from the east," Jake observed, his weathered face showing the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing a good plan come together. "Looks like the whole Morrison clan, plus some folks I don't recognize." She followed his gaze and felt her heart stop. Among the approaching riders was a familiar figure, tall, straight in the saddle, moving with the easy grace that had first caught her attention 2 years ago. Calder Boone had come home. He dismounted near the barn, with the same fluid economy of motion, she remembered, but something had changed in the month since his departure. The careful distance, the professional reserve that had marked his interactions, even during their most intimate moments, had been replaced by something warmer and more open. "Arabella," he said, and her name on his lips carried all the tenderness she had dreamed of hearing during the long nights when she wondered if she would ever see him again. Calder. She couldn't manage anything more eloquent, too overwhelmed by his unexpected presence to form coherent thoughts. From his coat, he withdrew her father's pocket watch, its gold case gleaming in the autumn sunlight. "I believe this belongs to you," he said quietly, along with an explanation of why it took me so long to realize where I belonged. The watch was warm from being carried close to his heart, and when she opened it, she found a new inscription engraved beside her grandfather's original words. "Time passes, honor endures, love conquers all." Below that, in smaller script, "CB to AV, October 1885. I spent 6 months in Dakota Territory," he continued, his grey eyes holding hers, with an intensity that made her forget about the gathering crowd, the approaching ceremony, everything except the man standing before her. "Good work, important work, the kind of mission I've always found meaning in. But every morning I woke up thinking about you, about this place, about the life I could have here if I was brave enough to choose it." The admission cost him something. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way he held himself as if prepared for rejection. This was a man who had spent years protecting himself from emotional attachment, who had convinced himself that duty was safer than love, that service was more reliable than happiness. "What changed your mind?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "A letter," he said, reaching into his coat again, "from Margaret." The impossibility of the statement left her speechless. Margaret Boone had been dead for more than 20 years. Could she have written a letter that reached him in Dakota Territory? "Not a new letter," Calder clarified, seeing her confusion. "One I'd never opened, one that was delivered to my quarters the day after she died. I carried it with me for 21 years, too afraid to read what might be her final words to me." He pulled out a folded paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from being carried close to his heart. "I finally found the courage to open it last month, when the loneliness got so bad that I couldn't function anymore. And what I found was permission to be happy, permission to love again, permission to honor her memory by living fully instead of just existing." The letter was brief, written in the same careful hand Arabella had seen in the other correspondence. But these words carried a weight and urgency that spoke of a woman who knew her time was running short. "My beloved Calder," it read, "if you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I am no longer with you. I know your heart, know how you will blame yourself, how you will carry guilt that belongs to no one but God and circumstance. But I need you to understand, something our love was not diminished by being cut short. It was made more precious, more meaningful, more worthy of honor, because we knew how fragile it was. Do not let grief make you smaller than you are. Do not let fear keep you from finding love again. Somewhere in this world is a woman who needs the kind of man you are, who will value your strength and gentleness, who deserves the chance to make you happy. When you find her, love her completely. That is not betrayal, that is the greatest tribute you could pay to what we shared." The words blurred as tears filled Arabella's eyes. This woman she had never met, this wife who had been lost to time and disease, had reached across death itself to give her blessing to what they had found together. "So I resigned my commission," Calder continued, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Told the federal marshals that Captain Boone was retiring from active service and that from now on I'm just Calder rancher, horse trainer, and hopefully the husband of the most remarkable woman in Montana Territory. The proposal was implicit but unmistakable, offered not with grand gestures or elaborate speeches, but with the quiet sincerity that had always been his greatest strength. This was a man who had finally learned that love didn't require the absence of other loyalties, that happiness wasn't selfish when it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying all the certainty she felt about their future together. "Yes to all of it, the marriage, the partnership, the life we'll build on this land that's brought us both so much pain and joy." His smile transformed his face completely, erasing the last traces of the careful reserve that had once kept them apart. When he kissed her, it was with the passion of a man who had finally stopped running from his own heart, who had learned that the greatest honor he could pay to his past was to embrace his future completely. Around them, the community that had gathered for what was supposed to be a harvest celebration began to realize they were witnessing something far more significant. Jake was grinning like a man who had won a particularly satisfying bet, while Billy Hartwell looked like he might cry from sheer happiness. "Well," Jake called out to the crowd, "looks like we've got ourselves a wedding to plan along with everything else." The cheer that went up from the assembled ranchers, townspeople, and friends was deafening, a sound of pure joy that echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to bless their union with the approval of the entire territory. As the celebration moved into the barn, as the fiddles struck up the same tunes that had played during that first terrible barn dance, Arabella found herself dancing with the man she had once dismissed as worthless. But this time there was no mockery, no cruelty, no pride standing between them. There was only love, patient, tested, and strong enough to overcome every obstacle that life had placed in their path. The new ranch brand gleamed in the lamplight, its merged symbols telling a story of two legacies becoming one, two hearts finding their way home to each other despite all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. It represented not just their union, but the community they would help build, the family they hoped to raise, and the promise that some things were indeed worth fighting for. Outside, the stars were beginning to appear in the clear Montana sky, each one a distant fire that had survived unimaginable challenges to shine its light across the darkness. Like their love, like their hope, like their unshakable belief that honor and courage and simple human decency could triumph over any evil. Time would indeed pass, as it always did. But what they had built together, the love, the legacy, the community that had emerged stronger from its trials would endure long after the stars themselves had burned away into memory. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all.